This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Jackie Leonard, and in the early hours of Friday, the 19th of February, these are our main stories. NASA successfully lands a rover vehicle on Mars 7 months after leaving Earth. An inquiry in Colombia finds the army killed over 6,000 civilians under President Alvaro Uribe, passing them off as enemy combatants. And we'll hear how scientists are trying to create a robotic nose to detect cancer inspired by dogs. Also in this podcast, President Macron of France urges Europe and the US to urgently send coronavirus vaccines to developing countries. And we hear from Don McLean, 50 years since the release of American Pie. 7 months after leaving Earth and after a journey of nearly 500 million kilometres, the Perseverance rover has successfully landed on Mars. Engineers at NASA's Mission Control in California erupted with joy when confirmation of touchdown came through.
Touchdown confirmed. Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars, ready to begin seeking the sands of past life.
The six-wheeled vehicle will now spend at least the next 2 years drilling into the local rocks, looking for evidence of past life. Moments after the landing, Tim Franks got reaction from Dr. Suzanne Schwenzer, senior lecturer in Earth Sciences from the Open University in the UK.
It's amazing. So now we have 2 live rovers, Curiosity and Perseverance, and a live lander. Don't forget InSight, operating on Mars at the same time. We've just seen the arrival of the United Arab Emirates and the Tianwen-1 orbiter. Tianwen-1 carries a rover that will land in the future. So it's just such an amazing time. And for NASA to set this rover down as if they were landing an aircraft at Heathrow Airport, that's just so amazing. I'm still shaking.
Yeah, obviously it's not just about the distance, but the tremendous heat they had to encounter as they pierced the atmosphere, and also the fact that that atmosphere, from what I understand, is very, very thin. So there wasn't much scope for decelerating quickly, was there?
So no spacecraft can decelerate just with the atmosphere, but the lightweight ones like the MER rover Spirit and Opportunity, they could slow down with a parachute enough so they could land in airbags. But Curiosity and Perseverance, they have the same size. They are about a metric ton. That's way too heavy for airbags to take the impact, and that's why they had to invent this really complex sky crane maneuver.
We're also hoping to get, aren't we, from some of the cameras and even some of the microphones on board, a real sense of the sounds as well as the sights of the Red Planet.
Yes, of course. I mean, these cameras are mounted on a mast for a reason. And the reason is that you then have that same perspective that you would have if you were there yourself. And these images, for me as a geologist, they are data. If I see these images, I can start to interpret and to understand this landscape. And so having those images plus the spectral information, the information how the light is actually composed, which then can give me mineralogical information, tells me a lot about the landscape from just in quotes, those images. But then we have, of course, all the other instruments. And hearing the wind on Mars for the first time will be amazing. It will really feel to be there.
How long will we have those sights and sounds of Mars for?
Well, you have always the nominal mission, which is how long we plan. And for Curiosity, that was 2 years. And we are now in year 8 of operations of Curiosity. And in case of Perseverance, that mission wants to cage and collect these samples and put these sample tubes into certain places so that they can be collected. That's the nominal mission. And if the rover is still happy and in one piece, why not continue and use all the instruments that it has to understand Jezero Crater even better?
And just in terms of collecting those samples, how tricky is that going to be, and when are we likely to get them?
Well, First of all, collecting them on Mars causes a lot of decision making because you have a limited number of sample tubes and you want to get a baseline sample. You want to know what is the main area made of, but you also want to get these special areas where you had water interact with rocks, where you could think that there might have been life. If it ever had been there, it would have been there. So you want to sample those. And so there will be this Mars year of decision making, of filling these sample tubes. And then there is a Mars Fetch rover planned for 2026 currently. And so if that all goes to plan in terms of Earth plans and timelines, then we will get the samples back then.
Dr. Suzanne Schwenzer of the Open University. And NASA's Perseverance Mars rover has been tweeting already, of course it has, including a picture of the planet's surface and the message, "My first look at my forever home." An investigation in Colombia has found that the army killed nearly 6,500 civilians between 1988 and 2014, when the former right-wing president Álvaro Uribe was in office. The victims had been falsely identified as left-wing rebels and paramilitaries. We heard more from our Americas editor, Leonardo Rocha.
Innocent civilians, usually peasants or people from the outskirts of the big cities, they were killed and falsely identified as rebels or members of paramilitary groups. So what these soldiers did is they even dressed them as rebels or as paramilitaries, put guns in their hands, and then presented them to their superiors. With that, they could be promoted. You had, in these 6 years, you had almost 6,500 people killed that way. Many of them were people who were sent to these areas by the army, put on minibuses, say, "We have a job for you, you're going to work there," and then just killed for that purpose.
How likely is it that people involved in carrying out killings like this will see justice?
I don't know if that will happen because there is this scandal. The first investigation came up in 2008. The UN was involved and the United States was involved. The problem we have here is this peace court was set up as part of the peace process that put an end to the war between the FARC and the government. The aim is to find the truth. And if people admit or they own up to what they've done, the punishment is very low. It's unlikely that you're going to get to the higher people in the army, the people who knew about that at a higher level. Probably you're going to know what happened, which for many of the families, it brings some closure, and you might have lower penalties for these people.
What sort of impact is all of this having on the peace process between government and FARC rebels?
It's going to be negative. It's very negative because we have now in Colombia a right-wing government that rejected the peace process. So it's a very serious situation, and many former FARC members have been killed by paramilitary, supposedly. And what they are going to say now is that shows that the government is siding with the army and with the right wing.
Leonardo Rocha. Senior Democrats in Washington say there'll be an investigation into how winter storms across the US have managed to paralyse energy supplies in Texas, leaving thousands of homes without heating. At least 31 people have died nationwide, and the extreme conditions are forecast to continue until the weekend. Patrick Payton is the mayor of the city of Midland in Texas.
It's the storm of a century, and this is something we have not gone through before, with rolling blackouts all over our city, with people having water issues and gas and electricity issues. And we're hoping to be getting to the end of this by the end of the week, but just when we think temperatures are going to begin rising, once again, we're predicting snow and maybe ice this afternoon. But even in the worst of times, we see people here in Midland and all over Texas coming out to help one another and do the best they can to help each other. But it's a difficult time and something we've never been through.
Our correspondent Barbara Plett-Usher reports.
Texans have experience with natural disasters, like hurricanes, but this is a whole new kind of misery. The coldest temperatures in a generation knocked a third of the state's power grid offline earlier in the week. People have been hunting for warmth wherever they can find it.
Inside of the house, it's almost like -2 or -1. It's really cold inside.
We're just hoping the lights will come back soon enough, because it's really freezing. It's horrible.
The icy weather and power outages have also affected water systems. Millions of people have been told to boil their tap water, which isn't always possible. Hundreds of thousands of homes across the country have lost electricity, but nowhere is it as bad as Texas. It was a system-wide failure, says the governor, Greg Abbott.
The fact is, every source of power the state of Texas has access to has been compromised because of the ultra-cold temperature or because of equipment failures.
In fact, the state did not weatherproof its power plants, even though it was hit with a freak freeze 10 years ago, because that's expensive to do and it wasn't mandatory. Plus, Texas doesn't share its power grid with nearby states to avoid federal regulations, so it can't get emergency supplies. But this disaster has renewed debate about how global warming affects winter storms and the need to adapt to changing weather.
Barbara Pletasher. The UN Security Council has again warned that Yemen is on the brink of famine. The UN's envoy to the country, Martin Griffiths, said the latest Houthi rebel offensive against government forces was putting millions of civilian lives at risk. A fresh appeal has been made for billions of dollars to fund aid operations. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams reports.
Martin Griffiths said the military situation in Yemen was extremely tense, more than at any time since he took the job of Special Envoy 3 years ago. Mr. Griffiths said the Houthi attack on the government stronghold of Marib had to stop. Sources in the city say displaced civilians continue to flee from camps close to the front lines. But if Marib is the focus of international attention, the situation across Yemen remains dire. Mark Lowcock, the UN's Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, told the meeting that malnutrition rates are running at record highs. 400,000 children are starving to death. Those children, he said, are in their last weeks and months. The Biden administration's renewed focus on Yemen, with the appointment of its own special envoy and an end to support for offensive operations by the Saudi-led coalition, has offered a glimmer of hope that diplomatic efforts to end the war may now gather pace. But in the meantime, the Houthi rebels, backed by Iran, seem to think they have the upper hand.
That was Paul Adams. Now, we know they're our best friends, but dogs can also save our lives. We know they can be trained to sniff out COVID and diabetes. Now, scientists are trying to create a robotic dog nose to help detect prostate cancer. Charlotte Gallagher reports.
If you've ever had a dog or spent time with one, you'll know how much they love sniffing. The area of the canine brain that's devoted to analysing scent is 40 times greater than that in a human's, so their nose helps them understand the world around them. Whereas we can easily identify smells like coffee and flowers, dogs can detect much more complex scents. Some are trained to use that superior sense of smell to sniff out diseases like cancer. Claire Guest is the Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of Medical Detection Dogs.
What they do at the moment is they look for the volatiles, the smelly molecules that are in urine or other samples that indicate that somebody definitely does have cancer. And they can do this incredibly reliably. And actually for prostate cancer, they're much more reliable than the PSA blood test, which unfortunately has a 75% false positive rate.
So we know what dogs can do, but it takes time to train them, so their availability is limited. Scientists in the UK and US are working on developing a machine that can do what a dog does, essentially a robotic nose. 2 dogs, a red fox Labrador called Florin and Midas, a Hungarian Vizsla, have been working with teams, including at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who are researching the device. Here's Claire Guest again.
Cancer is something that affects people worldwide, and what we need to do is we need to learn and translate this remarkable thing a dog can do into an electronic device that could save millions of people around the globe. There's still work to be done, and this translational work, which will follow, is the work where the dogs will teach our artificial intelligence scientists, what this cancer smells like and what that can mean.
The eventual aim then is to have a cheap device that can detect not just prostate cancer, but other diseases, all developed with the help of a dog's nose.
Charlotte Gallagher. Still to come, we'll be looking back at the life of one of Russia's most respected actors, Andrei Myakhov, who has died at the age of 82. The French President Emmanuel Macron has called on the West to send up to 5% of their coronavirus vaccine supplies to developing countries as quickly as possible. He made the remarks in a newspaper interview on the eve of a G7 video summit. Mike Sanders has the details.
President Emmanuel Macron said vaccine rollouts in developed countries were leading to an unprecedented acceleration of global inequality. African nations were being asked to pay twice as much for vaccines as the European Union, he said. Russia and China were stepping in to fill the gap, and it was becoming a war of influence. He urged Western countries to send a small amount of their stocks and to do it quickly so people on the ground could see that they weren't forgotten.
Mike Sanders. One of the questions about coronavirus has been how long people who have had it stay immune afterwards. Now research from an Austrian ski resort at the centre of a major coronavirus outbreak last year has shown that months later, most of the people who caught it were still immune. Our correspondent in Vienna is Bethany Bell.
It's a very interesting study. In April, after this big outbreak in the ski resort of Ischgl, scientists went and tested around 1,500 people who live in Ischgl, practically the whole of the town's population. And they discovered that back then, 42% of people had antibodies. So basically, 42 of the local people from Ischgl had caught coronavirus. They then did a follow-up study in November, which found that 90% of those people still had antibodies. And they say that this study is one of the biggest of its kind and over one of the longest period of its kind. So it shows that people still have protection quite a long time after the initial infection. And then they found something else out, or they think that this shows something that could be quite positive, which is that in Ischgl, this level of protection, of immune stability of around 40%, combined with wearing masks and social distancing, seems to have protected the rest of the population. Because while the rest of Austria and a lot of Europe has been going through a big second wave, in Ischgl, the number of new infections last autumn was less than 1%. So the scientists are saying that what we could start seeing is that once people are vaccinated to around 40 or 50% and you still have a bit of masking and social distancing, you could see similar levels of protection.
And just so I've understood this correctly, the concern with antibodies wasn't that they wouldn't be generated, but they wouldn't necessarily last for a long period of time. So the